You are listening to the Daily Treasure Podcast produced by Mark Inc. Ministries. Thank you for joining us today. Today's devotional is called, "And the Boy Grew in the Presence of the Lord." Today's treasure. Then Elkanah went home to Ramah, and the boy was ministering to the Lord in the presence of Eli the priest. Samuel was ministering before the Lord, a boy clothed with a linen ephod. And his mother used to make for him a little ephod, and take it to him each year when she went up with her husband to offer the yearly sacrifice. Then Eli would bless Elkanah and his wife and say, "May the Lord give you children by this woman for the petition she asked of the Lord." So then they would return to their home. Indeed, the Lord visited Hannah, and she conceived and bore 3 sons and 2 daughters. And the boy Samuel grew in the presence of the Lord. 2 Samuel 2:11 and 18 through 21. Slowly, life crashed down on Hannah. Year after year she longed for a child, but God closed her womb. Her default mode in the face of disappointment was to continue her practice of corporate worship and prayer. Next week we will see that her personal worship grew deep roots into the heart of God, and that intimacy equipped her and enabled her to choose to trust God when her heart was breaking. We will unpack Hannah's beautiful worship song in 2 Samuel 2. But now, let's take a few minutes to soak up some of Hannah's joy that eventually filled her life. We see that Samuel accepted the call to serve God. Then Elkanah went home to Ramah, and the boy was ministering to the Lord in the presence of Eli the priest. Samuel was ministering before the Lord, a boy clothed with a linen ephod. 2 Samuel 2:11 and 18. We also see that Hannah did not turn over her boy to Eli and forget him. No, every year she carefully created a little robe for her boy and delivered it to Samuel when she traveled with her family to Shiloh for their annual worship pilgrimage. During those visits, Eli blessed Hannah and asked the Lord to bless Elkanah and her with more children. Then Eli would bless Elkanah and his wife and say, "May the Lord give you children by this woman for the petition she asked of the Lord." So then they would return to their home. 2 Samuel 2:20. We don't know how long the Lord waited, but he gave Hannah the desires of her heart. Indeed, the Lord visited Hannah, and she conceived and bore 3 sons and 2 daughters. And the boy Samuel grew in the presence of the Lord. 2 Samuel 2:21. Hannah's life overflowed with children that she knew God gave to her. I see such treasures in the births of these 5 children. Not only did they fill Hannah's heart with love, they filled her days with enormous responsibilities that kept her moving forward. I think every mother can relate to the joy Hannah must have experienced as she looked into the eyes of each newborn little child. It's not hard to imagine her singing joyful songs of praise and thanksgiving after each birth. It's in the darkness that we often experience some of the greatest treasures. We don't know why God closed Hannah's womb, yet we see her faith deepen. We watch as God in mercy opens her womb and places in it a little baby that would one day serve God's people as a faithful and godly priest. Hannah's son would be a stark contrast to the worthless sons of Eli. As a little boy, Samuel heard God speak to him, and one day Samuel would anoint David as God's chosen king. Hannah's broken heart drove her to lament before her God. What incredible trust we see that she has in him, to vow to give her firstborn son to God. Out of the darkness came the priceless treasure. Out of Hannah's womb, God brought a man who would communicate God's truth to his people. In the darkness, God gives us treasures that help turn our hearts toward him and remind us that he calls us by name. During a very rocky road in my own life pilgrimage, Hannah's story encouraged me to embrace the truth that God is sovereign and I can trust him. Hannah calls back to each of God's children that he hears our cries and he responds with mercy.
Friends, thanks so much for joining us on our pilgrimage fueled by hope. And thank you so much for those who share with us your own stories of how God is using Daily Treasure to encourage you to walk by faith, even in some really hard places. And one of those hard places is when we have been betrayed, when someone has violated our trust. Maybe they've lied to us, or they've cheated, or there's some kind of abuse, or putting their own interests ahead of ours when they promised otherwise. And I want to encourage you to listen to our Help and Hope podcast that we are offering this week. It is with our guest, Wendy Alsop, who is the author of I Forgive You. And Wendy has been a guest on the podcast before, and she's one of those women I could just talk to for hours. I just am so eager for you to hear her wisdom and her perspective on God's grace in the middle of brokenness. We talk about the story of betrayal from her own life, not only through an unwanted divorce, but also in her church life, which seems like a lot of people are talking about that right now. But Wendy doesn't leave us in the muck of betrayal. She pulls examples from her own life and talks about the difference between forgiveness and reconciliation, and something that I think is very intriguing, how to understand ambiguous loss as we grieve the losses of betrayal. So, friend, whether you are gasping for air as the impact of betrayal hits you hard, or you are carrying the wounds of broken relationships from years ago, I know this conversation is going to help guide you through the minefields of grief and loss. So make sure to check out my conversation with Wendy Alsop called I Forgive You. Go to helpandhopenow.org. That's helpandhopenow.org. Click the Help and Hope link. And I know, again, that God is going to encourage you in your own walk of faith as you listen to this conversation about forgiveness. I'm Sharon Betters, and I look forward to being with you tomorrow.